Kingham, WA4BQM, did I get that right? Is going to talk to us about propagation, especially as it may or may not relate to field day. This is going to be an exciting presentation. I hope we all learn a lot. Thank you, Kerry. Okay, I hope that that's working. All right, we're going to talk about... Would you like the lights off, I think. We're going to talk about propagation.
Not working. It's switch on down.
Yeah, it is. Okay, it's working.
Okay, now it is.
I don't want to hold it if I don't have to. Everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to talk about propagation for field day. But if you go to the next slide, the characteristics of field day will be similar to the summers for the next few years because the main characteristics are sunlight maximum, and in fact, field day is always at sunlight maximum, and sunspot minimum. Next slide. This is a graph of the length of day during the year, and we're approaching this point right now. And field day is just after the peak. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at this and you take about 15 minutes less than the maximum, you find that that goes from about the middle of May to August, beginning of August. So from about the 21st of May to the 1st of August, there's no less than 15 minutes less daylight during that period. So for the entire first part of the summer, except for August and September, we're at as much sunlight as we ever have. Next slide. This is a look at the solar cycle, and we are down here. Now, if you look over here, we went under 80 on the flux at the middle of 06, and it didn't go back again until 11, the middle of 11. So that's like 5 years. So we hope that the next one isn't going to be that long, but we have no way of knowing until it turns around and starts going back up again. So for the next few years, it's quite likely that we're going to be in this position. That is, in the summer, it's going to be sunlight maximum and sunspot minimum. And those are the characteristics that are going to determine what the propagation does. Next slide. Okay, what we're doing is we're bouncing HF signals off of the ionosphere. And this is what the ionosphere looks like. In the daytime, you have a D layer, which is primarily absorption, an E layer, and the F layer splits in two, so you have an F1 and an F2. At night, the E layer and the D layer go away. The F layer combines into a single layer. And I like this diagram because it shows that, in fact, this all happens beyond the terminator. That is, the sunlight comes in and hits the ionosphere above after you get into dark. The ionosphere above you is still illuminated, so you still have some effect until you get really dark. And in the summer, that takes even longer because the Earth is tilted, the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun. So the fact that we'll get into what happens with the D and E layer disappearing. Next slide. So the ham bands that we're using below 10 megahertz, that is 80 and 40 and 160, are primarily whether the band is open or not depends upon the absorption, which is the D layer. So 80 and 40 meters are open in the daytime under normal circumstances. They're only open at night when the D layer goes away. Above 10 megahertz, whether the signal gets refracted, gets bent back by the F layers usually, or the E layers, has a major influence on whether the band is open or not. So 20 through 10 meters are open during the daytime when you have good reflection or good refraction in the F layer. And at cycle peak, you can even have 20 and 17 meters open at night. And 30 meters is always open with quotes, because it isn't really, but if you look at this, that's what it says. Next slide. And for field day, I'm going to talk about the 80, 40, 20, 15, and 10 meter HF bands. 160 is really middle frequencies. It has some really weird propagation that I'm not really I don't want to get into. And 6 meters is the beginning of VHF. And I will mention a very little bit about 6 meters. Next. Okay, we have lower solar activity. We have low sunspots. So that modifies things. The F layer is less dense because there isn't the solar activity making it thicker. There isn't any flares or CMEs or even the other activity that goes on that helps the F layer. So the higher frequencies are less likely to be refracted back to Earth. So 15 and 10 meters will be only open during the day, if then. The E layer is much less in play, but I'll mention a little bit about that later on. The D layer has much lower absorption, which means that 80 and 30 meters, 80 through 30 meters, or in our case 80 and 40 meters, is open more during the day, and we'll see a little bit of that. Next slide. Okay, this is another look at it. Notice that the E layer is at 50 kilometers. The F layer, the beginning of the F layers, are at 200. That's 4 times higher. That means that when you send a wavelength, a signal up, and it gets bent back by the F layers, it's got 4 times the distance, and that means you'll get a much greater skip distance. We'll get into that a little bit. And then if it comes off the E layer. So the E layer being lower will have closer skip, or shorter skip. Now, the other thing about this is that if you send a signal straight up, it goes through the minimum of the D layer. If you go in at an angle, you're increasing the amount of time your signal's in the D layer. If you go in vertically, you're minimizing the D layer. This means that the lower frequencies, 80 and 40 meters, if you shoot an 80 meter or 40 meter signal straight up, it may make it, particularly now where the D layer isn't that thick, you'll make it through the D layer up to the F layer where you'll always be refracted back down, and you have sort of a fountain where your signal's going up and there's some angle in which it makes it through the D, gets refracted back down and comes back down again. That's NVIS, near vertical incidence skywave. So you get that on the lower frequencies in the daytime. The other thing that happens is that the higher frequencies, when the F layer combines, there may not be enough charged particles up here to bring your signal back down no matter what, and you'll lose the skip and nothing happens. I might also add that if you send like a 20 meter signal up through here at a vertical incidence, there may not be enough charged particles up here to turn it around and send it back down. It may take a glancing blow, if you will, to turn it around. So you'll get a hole where you can't hear your 20 meter signal because all of the power is going straight up through the ionosphere. Next slide. And this is that kind of situation here. If you have a high enough angle, incidence angle on 20 meters, say, it comes up, it gets refracted, but it doesn't get refracted enough to come back down. At some angle, it will be going through both enough of the ionosphere to bend it enough to bring it back down. So it's a combination. You have less bending to do, and you have more ionosphere to do the bending if you're coming in on an angle. So there is a maximum angle at which signals will come back down. At the other end is usually how high above the horizon your antenna is squirting a signal. And with most ham antennas of the wire type, if it's not too high, you're probably lucky if you're getting 7 to 10, and 15 might be a little more, 15 degrees elevation might be a little more reasonable. If you have a high tower with a beam on it, you might get down to about 3 degrees to 5 degrees, but that's it. So you have an area between the highest angle that comes back down and the lowest angle your antenna actually is squirting a signal. Remember, there can be something away in the ground too, which will stop your low angle from getting out. And this area comes down here, and you can talk to somebody here, but you cannot talk to somebody who's too close. So in this diagram, a signal from San Francisco skips right over Denver, but you can hear it in Chicago. In the second hop, you can't hear it in like Pittsburgh and Cleveland, but you can hear it in New York. So you have these skip zones where you can't hear something, and the skip areas where you can hear the signal from your transmitter. Next slide.
Can I go back to that slide?
Sure.
So part of field day strategy is to work continuously over a period of time, because the ionosphere is changing.
Right.
So when you couldn't talk to Denver, later you might be able to.
Yeah, and I'll get to that. I'll get to that. But that is one of the.
Richmond and Fairfax.
Okay, so and remember again, the near vertical on 20 meters doesn't come back down, but on 80 and 40 it probably will, if it gets through the D layer, and this time of the solar cycle it probably will. So let's go on to the next slide. I wasn't going to talk about the E layer because you can't really tell what you're using. You can be bouncing off the E layer, you can be bouncing off the F layer. As long as the signal comes back down, you don't matter. But during the solar eclipse QSO party, the main propagation layer for 20 meters was the E layer, which was a surprise to everybody. It means you get shorter skip. And one of the results of that is that on Saturday afternoon of field day, when you start working, you might have E layer in the sunlight because you're you're 2 in the afternoon. You're actually 1 hour after the sun's directly over, or as high overhead as it gets. And then later on, as the sun moves over and you have less illumination directly overhead or around you, that may change to F. And when that happens, your skip will go from short to long. Okay? And the same thing happens on Sunday morning. You'll start in the morning with F layer, and then the afternoon or early afternoon, it might change to F, and the skip will suddenly shorten. So that's something you might be aware of. There's another thing called sporadic E. Sporadic E, the last time I gave a talk on propagation here, I said no one understands sporadic E. They do now. Sporadic E is connected to the weather. This was a surprise to hams, and particularly the ham who discovered this, but not to the professional propagation guys. The professional propagation models use weather models as part of their input because they know and have discovered that the weather affects propagation. But it really affects sporadic E. So if we get the conditions, which is a high high velocity jet stream and the beginning a low pressure with thunderstorms, you might get sporadic E forming. And that's the probable mode if 10 meters opens over a big area and has really loud signals. There are other propagation, 10 meters and 15 meters will have other propagation, low priority, short times, and not sporadic E. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to go through a bunch of propagation predictions. And if you notice, I have here for illustration only. That's because in order to do propagation predictions, you have to specify a lot of things, like what the antenna is on both ends of your path, how much noise is at each end of your path, or at the receive end anyway, what the antenna is, and what the angle of the lowest angle of takeoff angle is for the antenna. So there's a lot of things that affect propagation predictions. I made some guesses about typical field day operations and put them into the mix, and I can talk about that after we're over and what exactly I did. And I fudged it a little bit to get the answer I wanted. The second thing is that the propagation predictions used that are available to hams right now are essentially climate predictions as opposed to weather predictions. If you tell someone that in June the high temperature is 83, the average high temperature is 83 degrees, the average low temperature is 65, the highest ever recorded was 97, the lowest was 40. There's typically 2.5 inches of rain over 7 days of rain. It gives you an idea of what is going to happen in June, but doesn't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. And that's the situation with these propagation predictions. They are basically climate. This is the situation, and this is the probability that things happen in June in the conditions we have now. Doesn't tell you at all what's going to happen on field day. But it gives you an idea of what's going on. So next slide. So this is 80 meters. All of the predictions start at the start of field day, 1800 UTC. They're every 3 hours. So this is the first half of field day. And there'll be another slide that's the second half of field day. In 80 meters, you notice there's a little bit of NVIS at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you get a little bit more because the sun's getting over, and what's happening is that off to the east, it's even lower. So you're getting a skip out over the ocean, which doesn't do us any good. But you get a little bit more result.
What is your circuit reliability? What's the difference?
That is the number of days per month that this propagation will occur. Okay? So basically the red is every day. The yellow and green here is around half or a little over half the days of the month. Okay?
Could I ask, why are you doing all of this?
To give you an idea of why you use different bands at different times and what kind of results you're going to get on field day. If you're going to use 80 meters during the early days of early parts of Saturday, you're not going to get very far. You're going to work these guys out really quick.
But this is you don't have the actual weather for that day. So this is just an assumption, right? Theoretical exercise, right?
It is a long-term average of the kind of conditions that occur in the month. With this kind of solar activity and the time of the month and the hour. If you, let me put it this way, the only thing that's likely to happen on field day that isn't taken care of in here is you have some sort of solar activity occur. If that happens, 80 meters is going to shut down completely, okay? Because the absorption is going to go up and you're not going to get anything. That's the flip side. As the sun gets over and you get to 8 o'clock at night, we start seeing more of the country coming in. And notice again, it's continuous from your antenna site out to about the Mississippi River. There's a lot of field day stations in there. As you get later, it starts creeping westward. Next slide. Until you finally get to 2 o'clock in the morning, and you're covering most of the continental or actually North America, except for Alaska and Hawaii. And that situation continues until sunrise. At sunrise, absorption goes up, bouncing off goes down because the signal can't get through, and by 11 o'clock in the morning you have nothing again except very local vertical incidence skywave. I might add that if for those of you who don't know this, in Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico has a line of mountains down the middle. Most of the people live on the coast. FEMA set up a bunch of offices around Puerto Rico. There was no infrastructure. There was no way to talk over the mountains. So they used HF with NVIS to send a signal up to the ionosphere and have it come down on the other side of the mountains. So that's how they kept their offices in contact. Next slide. Go on to 40 meters. 40 meters has a bigger NVIS area at the beginning. In fact, it covers most of the area east of the Mississippi River. There's a lot of field day stations in there. As the sun moves over, you get a little more chance of a skip. And then as we get to sunset, it starts going across the country. But at 11 o'clock, if you look at 11 o'clock at night, the NVIS in the middle is starting to disappear. Not there. Next slide. And in fact, by 2 o'clock in the morning, you're all skipped. There's no vertical, all the vertical signal on 40 meters is going right through the ionosphere. And I want to point out one thing in this set here, which just gives you an idea of what can cover. I want you to look at this patch right here, and the same patch over here. And you notice that there's no signal coming down in the area, what is that? Idaho, Nevada, that area. But there is a possibility that you'll be making contact here. So you're on 40 meters, you've got a good signal going in, you're calling CQ and people are answering you, and everything is going along fine in here. And as the day starts to move along, the skip zone changes. And you start hearing stations in here, and they start hearing you. There's always some joker in here who only gets on HF on 80 meters at 7 a.m. in the morning, running a kilowatt to talk to his friends 100 miles away. He has no idea about propagation, but he's on 40 meters on field day, and all of a sudden, he's sitting there calling CQ and getting answers, and you're sitting there calling CQ and getting answers, and then the skip changes, and the two of you are on top of each other. Since our friend has no idea what's going on, he starts making all sorts of interesting speculations about your ancestry. He tells you where to put various parts of your anatomy, and he tells you that you should have been listening before you transmitted because it's his frequency. Okay? Just be aware that happens. It's not your fault. It's his fault because he hasn't a clue as what's going on. Yeah?
I hadn't seen this image before.
Yeah.
But this very much looks like a beam pattern, looking at it from top down.
Yeah. There's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. The antennas being used in this calculation are high dipoles.
So you are taking the beam pattern.
Yes.
I thought this is only a weather-related phenomenon.
No. Beam patterns are part of the whole thing. They're part of the whole. Right. Yeah. This is a beam that I can go into that later if people exactly why I chose that. But it basically most of the field day stations out there that are in the field are throwing up wire antennas. Okay, and that's why I do this. And once again, with 40 meters, once the sun starts rising, it collapses back down to just the NVIS, and you're back to where you were. So 40 meters is very much open all the time, but better, or has more coverage at night, except for the area right around where you are. Next slide. 20 meters. 20 meters goes straight through on all of the vertical. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you have at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you have a small chance of reaching Hawaii. By 0 hours, by 8 at night, you have a good chance of getting, you have a 50-50 chance of getting Alaska. And you have a 50-50 chance at 11 o'clock at night of getting Hawaii. Now, this is actually a little, this is a little conservative. And the reason why it's conservative is there are a lot of guys out there who are D-class stations that you can talk to, and they're using their tower and beams. So they've got more punch. They will hear you, and you will hear them, even if the two dipoles don't hear you. So this is actually a little conservative. So even though it's 50-50, chances are you will work Alaska and Hawaii on 20 meters in the evening on field day. Next slide. Yeah.
Because of the time zone differences between here and Hawaii, would they not be able to talk back?
No. This is both ways. Go back one. Yeah. This is both ways, okay. And the reason is that, in fact, at this time, the sun is over here, and it's actually helping the second and third skip.
Okay.
Okay. That's one of the things that's going on, and you can see the skip zone here. This is the first skip zone, the second skip zone, and the third skip zone, where it's bouncing, and because you can see over here, there's very little because that's been in darkness for a while. But this part is still is either still illuminated or still hasn't completely relaxed yet. And so it becomes very much Western oriented after sunset. Before sunrise, next slide, it's the other way around. It's very Eastern oriented. Of course, most of that stuff's out in the ocean, so it doesn't help. Notice that by 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning, there's nothing. Okay? And then as the sun rises again, you start getting skip again. Next. 15 meters. Next slide. Not much. Okay, now, I want to point out that this is global and, as I said, climatological, if you will. You will get certain times and certain places where you might get an opening. So it's worth checking for that, because this kind of analysis does not handle short time. Actually, I have one. It has short. It doesn't worry about things that happen over a short period of time and don't repeat that well. So you may get some openings. So it's worth checking. Next slide. You can get some you can get some tropo. You can get E-skip if you get the jet stream and the low pressure systems. You can get sporadic E rather. There are things that happen, but it's not something you can repeat on a regular basis, so it isn't covered in this. But there are things. This is 10 meters. And I might add that a lot of people around here have made contacts on 10 meters as late as 0 hours into the Midwest. So there are openings. You know, it's just that they're short and not very repeatable. Can you go back a couple to the 40 meters again? One more, that one. We have a 40-meter digital net that meets at 0 hours on Tuesdays. And we regularly have check-ins from Arizona and across Canada and Georgia. We also get them from other places, and occasionally we've had one from Oregon. So this is actually pretty good for what we're actually seeing with the propagation. Next, go through 10 meters where there's nothing. Okay, whoops, go forward, right? You know, so 15 meters, 10 meters, there isn't very much. It's going to be, you're going to have to check it. You're going to have to see whether there's anything there. Anything that is there is likely to be fairly short, like on the order of an hour. And it would probably be a small geographical area, and that geographical area may move. So anyway, let's do the summary. 10 and 15 meters should be checked from time to time, but don't expect much. 20 meters is your primary daytime band, continuing into dusk and starting before dawn. Middle of the night, not so much. 40 meters is open to somewhere all 24 hours. Now that's a good statement, but think about that. Some of this, and believe me, last solar minimum we ran into this on field day. You're open to the entire country at once. You have every field day station in the United States that you're hearing. Okay? That's not necessarily a good thing. And 80 meters is nighttime only. So that's it. Yeah? Okay. The difference between voice and CW and digital is about, well, it's a little less than 20 dB. So they'll be a little bit better than what I've shown here. Okay? But probably not a lot better. Yeah.
Second question.
Wait, let's take this one here and then I'll go back to you. Oh, is this a follow-up? Okay.
I think this is very useful data. It would be ideal if you could put it in a table. On a table that you could hand out to the pen cap to say during this time to this time, this is the frequency.
We can put it on the schedule.
Like a spreadsheet.
Put it on a spreadsheet. I mean, just
Something that you could hand out to people as a starting point.
You know. Yeah.
I was curious about working backscatter on 15 pointing the beam south.
Right.
Because I think that's where you would do it.
Right. Well, if you remember, Howard can go back to 15. Yeah.
On 15.
Yeah. You get things like this and there. Yeah, and you can get backscatter.
And I lest we be discouraged by the low sunspots on these higher bands. I remember, I don't remember which year it was, on 15 CW the band was effectively dead, but I was able to eke out about 30 contacts an hour, and that was a fun challenge.
Yeah.
It was very hard work, but it's like, oh,
right.
Well, I can't believe it.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah, it's worth trying and it's worth checking, you know, to see if you get an opening. But, you know, as you said, it's very hard work. Right, exactly. And you have to be a good operator. And one of the things, let me say, one of the things about field day is that the other stations are not necessarily good operators. Okay, they're people who have never worked HF or work it only casually, or it's like our friend who only uses 80 meters at 7 a.m. in the morning with a kilowatt to talk to his friends 100 miles away. He's used to armchair copy, and he has no idea how to pull out a poor signal. He may not even be able to hear a poor signal. So the question is, one of the problems is that you have to find the good operators as well. Yeah.
I'm a great listener to WWD to try to get an idea of what's going on publication-wise. I just had like an IRC back in 69.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty much always that.
Right.
But something that I've noticed recently, usually, and it varies as to when it occurs, but usually between about 10 a.m. and about 10 p.m. and about 3 a.m., is sometimes you'll hear either the 10 megahertz or the 15 megahertz WWD and WWDH. And so at the end of the minute, you'll hear the female voice announcing, and then you hear the male voice. And sometimes WWDH is stronger than WWD.
Right.
What is causing that to happen right now?
Well, part of it is that it's still sunlight over Hawaii, so they have an advantage in getting started. The other thing is they're running a lot more power than we do. Okay? But again, part of it's the skip distance. If on 15, particularly on 15 megahertz, if your skip is too long, you will not have a strong signal from Boulder or Fort Collins, wherever they are now. Yeah.
You made it's probably my memory is about beacons. Are there beacons where you can hear stuff coming in? I don't know how to use those.
I'm not 100% familiar with all of the beacons. I know there are some on 10 and 6. And I think there are some on the lower frequencies as well. One of the things these days that I find is useful is just look for FT8 and see if there are FT8 signals. Because if there are FT8 signals, something's open on that band. And that's a useful trigger for that. I wouldn't use it for field day because they're so slow, but they are. A lot of people are using it, and if there's any signal at all, I mean, they're on bands that you normally think of as closed, but somebody's on there trying, and you'll see their signals pop up. If you have a spectrum scope or something like that, you'll see their signals for the 15 seconds and then drop and then back up again and so on, and you can tell whether the band's open at all. Yeah.
Can I bounce that off of Doug? Doug, is your spotter do the FTA for spotting?
No, the automated spotter will only spot CW.
Okay.
But there's no reason why you can't open an adapter on a flex and look.
Yeah.
Leon has 7 of them.
But just go to PSK Recorder and have PSK Recorder on and use that as a vehicle. Now, the question is going to be, Kerry, how many FT8 operators will there be during the field day?
I cannot tell you that. I mean, I have no idea how many will be trying.
More or less, because FT8 is an acceptable mode during field day.
What more than less than what?
A typical Saturday.
Probably more.
I would think more.
I would think more.
Probably more.
Yeah.
So your best spotter is using PSK Recorder monitoring the band.
The problem is you may get too many long distance DX spots, which you're not interested in.
Yeah, but you can blow the American part up and ignore Europe.
Yeah.
Just a thought. Have that in the command center up and running.
Well, thank you, Kerry, for that presentation. And you did a great segue that you didn't even know about, because one of the things we're going to do is we're going to help everybody be a better operator between now and field day. And Mike is going to tell you a little bit about how that's going to happen at our next meeting.
So, if you remember last meeting, we talked a little bit about what happened last year.
and what we're going to do this year, thank you, Mike. This time we talked about the NM11 logging software we're going to use and propagation. So next time, come back on June 8th, we're going to play radio together. Remember in January we had the mock 2-meter net? We're going to do something kind of similar, but everybody's not going to bring their handhelds. We're going to play radio, and we're going to practice how do you send and receive the exchange message. We're going to do it in a very leisurely way at first, with one person calling CQ and scripted, one small group of people, another group of people, another group of people, another group of people calling and returning the CQ signal. Then we're going to do like 2-on-1, then 3-on-1. And we think that everybody gets that practice done, we're going to do it in good old American pilot. We're going to see how you do in a pilot. And we're going to do it for those who are running and those who are in the search and pounce mode. So we're going to practice how to be a good operator. We're going to start out with the DX Code of Conduct, because I think that's a good document to review. And we should pay attention, that is to say, don't step on your phone. Shoot KC above. And that's our during field day. For you, we'll have coffee, and we will calculate the calories per QSO, although Lee and I are committed to bring the calories down and the content and the quality of the food up. So with that, that's all I have to say.
Thanks. Well, thank you all for being here. Have a great evening. 7-3. The frequency is returned to normal amateur radio use.
Give yourselves a big hand.
Thank you to John, YMA